For your ears only for the week of November 20th and Thanksgiving, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Isaac Davey Aronson.
Your actions disrupted a devastating ambush before it could claim more lives. Your courage prevented the capture of an American soldier and brought that soldier back to his family.
I would give this back in a second to have my friends with me right now.
We can't even tell you, for example, how many forces we estimate will be coming out or reinvested come July 2011.
There was no question that the bravery of Staff Sergeant Salvatore Giunta in Afghanistan 3 years ago and his humility in Washington last week truly merited the Medal of Honor presented by President Obama. But questions about the war itself only multiplied, as suggested by Pentagon Press Secretary Jeff Morrell. Even as top NATO leaders meeting in Lisbon endorsed the Obama-announced July 11 start for a drawdown, they sent mixed signals on just what level of forces would remain after the proposed 2014 handoff to Afghan troops for training, for support, or whatever commanders think necessary in particular areas of insecurity.
To consider the new plan for Afghanistan and for NATO itself at a time of changing security threats and worldwide budget crunches, for your ears only, we have Sarwar Kashmeri. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of NATO 2.0, Reboot or Delete, from Potomac Books in March. Welcome to our program.
Thank you very much for having me.
For all the endorsement of 2011 and 2014 as the beginning and end of a U.S.-NATO drawdown in Afghanistan, the NATO chief also warned the Taliban not to think about waiting it out, that NATO would stay in some way to assure security. So is the commitment an endless quagmire?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, when you take the U.S. defense budget of $760 billion, the EU defense budget of $300 billion, add that together, that's $1 trillion, and we've been fighting against the Taliban that has almost no budget for 10 years and being fought to a draw. So the word quagmire is a really accurate description of what may happen, because the Brits have today announced that they intend to leave by the end of 2014. Poland said it's leaving, Canada's leaving, the Dutch have already left, so pretty quickly America could be by itself with our 100,000 troops and heading into this quagmire situation, and we need to be really, really careful about that.
What do you make of the stepped-up attacks on the Taliban, bringing in new armored tanks, it was reported last week, while trying to set up peace talks with them?
Well, I think that's a more military judgment. And in this case, the tanks were requested by the Marines who are taking over from the Brits in the Helmand province, where the Brits were drawn into some very tough fighting and had to pretty much back down. So I wouldn't want to double-guess the military needs in that area.
Just before the NATO session, an independent task force at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York concluded that the new Afghan timeline may be misguided, that if more progress is not evident after another year, drawdown should be speeded up and the strategy should shift to small force counterterrorism. What's your view?
And I think that ties in directly to the quagmire situation. I've skimmed that report that you just alluded to, and it points to a highly dangerous situation where if things do not get resolved with Pakistan, and if they don't have significant progress there, that the U.S. would indeed be headed towards a quagmire situation. So I believe that that report is right on the mark.
Let's turn to the larger role of NATO and its new strategic policy announced in Lisbon, including a new regional anti-missile shield and an out-of-area capability for operations like Afghanistan. Though so many NATO nations are going or gone from there, you say it's more sentimental than realistic in these tight economic times.
Well, you know, most people forget that the nations of NATO have to pay their own way when they go into a war. So in the case of Afghanistan, Poland, which is one of the larger contingents of 2,000 people, is paying $10 billion a year to keep its troops in Afghanistan, which is a tenth of its budget, entire defense budget. And so this whole idea of being an out-of-area force, I think, is more dream than anything else. And Afghanistan has shown the limits of it, and I don't believe that in the future the Europeans are going to step up and head anywhere very far very soon. So that's my opinion of it. I think the strategic concept endorses that, puts the ballistic missile plan into it, but I simply don't see how all of that can be done.
You also propose that NATO should be bridged to the European Union's military arm, its common security and defense policy. What is that exactly, and what force is at its disposal?
Well, keep in mind that NATO doesn't have any forces of its own. It has to bring in forces from its member countries. It is simply, if I may use the word, a bureaucracy to make things happen. The Europeans have set up such a bureaucracy. It's called CSDP, which they own, they run. They use the same troops that NATO uses. Over the last 10 years, they've sent out 27 crisis management missions. Most of them have been small, but there's been a sizable force of 4,000 attack troops in the center of Africa that they've deployed and maintained for 19 months. They have a naval flotilla patrolling off Somalia that's twice the size of NATO. They will, if you recall, did the compromise work during the Russia-Georgia conflict because NATO was unwelcome. So they're an increasing force, and it behooves NATO and the United States to begin connecting NATO to it so that the Europeans can start handling their own security on a day-to-day basis, but that they remain connected through NATO to Canada and the United States when the need is relevant.
So the only difference, I mean, if they're paying for the same forces, the only difference is that the U.S. and Canada are cut out from most of the operations of this European military force.
Indeed, and many of the missions that they sent out, there was no connection to Canada and the United States. They did it on their own. The European Union has roughly, if you add it together, about 2 million people under arms, about 10,000 tanks, 3,000 helicopters, and depending on what sign you paint on it, they can go to work for NATO or for CSDP.
Well, to the degree that NATO remains independent and tries to follow through on the missile shield you mentioned, how much real cooperation from Russia do you expect? And how big a roadblock to that cooperation is Republican opposition in the U.S. Senate to a New START treaty cutting U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons?
I think it's going to be very hard to get Russian cooperation, but having said that, let me say it's a great idea to have Russia involved as much as we can. I think we still have to come up against what I call the what crossroad, whose hand on the trigger, but that will be coming soon. As far as the Republican opposition, I think it's very misguided, but I would hasten to say not all Republicans are in opposition, Senator Lugar being the sterling example.
How important is the START treaty to other Russian-American cooperation in such areas as dealing with the Iranian nuclear threat? Other cooperative efforts that have been talked about seem to have been getting on the road, but people say might be stopped if this treaty doesn't go forward.
I think the biggest damage that could be done is to the president's credibility. And keep in mind that this is the first time since Mr. Reagan signed the Cold War START treaty that we are not able to verify what the Russians are doing. They can't verify what we're doing either, but we cannot verify what they're doing. It's a highly dangerous situation, and the opposition in the Senate really ought to put the country first and think about making political points later.
Sarwar Kashmeri is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of NATO 2.0, Reboot or Delete, from Potomac Books in March.
Quote from the news, "It's clear we will need some form of external assistance." That was Irish Finance Minister Brian Lenihan grudgingly admitting that his country needs international financial aid to rescue the banking industry and help stabilize the euro.
Up next, Inside the Shellacking, a new book on the Obama White House, for your ears only.